Hello, today is August the 5th, 2020. And if you're here for optimizing content development, grow your content faster than you grow your team with, Tom Johnson, Paul Gustafson, and Megan Gilhooly, you are in the right place. My name is Scott Abel, and I'll be your host for today's show. Let me tell you a few things about the webinar platform that we're using, BrightTalk. First, we can't see or hear you, so you don't have to worry about your microphone or your camera in this case. And we can't have a two-way conversation with you in a text. But what you can do during the show is you can ask us a question using the Ask a Questions tab located in your webinar viewing panel. It allows you to text a question to me, the host of the show. I'll monitor the questions from the back end of the software, and I'll propose them to the presenters at the end of the show with their time remaining. You can also get help in the attachments and links section. There's some frequently asked questions and troubleshooting information there that we want you to check out if you need to. And if you, the presenters want to poll you, they will tell you that they're going to ask you about a poll. And on your graphic user interface on the webinar viewing panel, you'll be displayed the question with the multiple choice answers. It's very easy. You click the right answer that you want. And we hope that you'll participate in those polls because it helps the presenters contextually with the rest of the presentation. Also, there's some additional content located in the attachments and links section of today's webinar viewing panel, including a PDF copy of today's slide deck, some information about each of our presenters, and some information provided by the sponsor. There's some great blog posts in there and some troubleshooting information. So we encourage you to check that out while you're on the show. And before you leave today, if you give our presenters some feedback using our 1 through 5-star rating system, I'll remind you about it at the end of the show. 5 is a high rating, 1 is a low. There's also a little field in which you can type some feedback to give to the presenters. I know that they appreciate the constructive criticisms that you have, so please do feel free to share at the end of the show. All right, without further ado, I'm going to welcome our first presenter, who's also my co-host of the Content Advantage talk show we do every other week, Megan Gilhooly. Megan, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Would you like to introduce the next two presenters and drive the presentation, and I'll wait in the background and take questions from the audience?
Sure thing. All right. So we have with us, who do we have? There we go. We have with us Tom Johnson, and Tom Johnson is with I'd Rather Be Writing. So Tom, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Megan. I'm glad to be here and participate.
Very good. And our other wonderful guest is Paul Gustafson, who is the leader of expert support. So Paul, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me, Megan.
You betcha. Scott? Oh, all right. We're just going to go.
Yeah,
all right,
there you go.
So we're going to get started. Okay. All right, so today we are talking about optimizing content development. We are specifically going to talk about how we grow our content faster than we grow our team. People are saying it's hard to hear me. Is it okay? Or is it...
Please don't be distracted by what people say in the chat room. Just continue on.
Okay.
It'll be fine. People do have an occasional audio problem, but it's nothing you can do anything about.
Okay. We will carry on. So what are we going to talk about today? We are going to cover some strategies for scaling content development without growing headcount. We are going to talk about pros and cons of centralizing documentation efforts versus having autonomous content silos, and then we'll also cover 8 elements for optimizing content delivery and the customer experience. So when we talk about scaling content without growing headcount, this is something you guys know a lot about, right? You guys both have a tremendous amount of experience with content, and when we scale any content team, we need to think about the experience that our writers have as well as the experience that our customers have. And so I'm going to present a bit of a model before we get into the weeds with you guys. This is a model I developed that really is a 2x2 that pits customer experience against author experience. And it's we have two axes. One would be, the bottom would be customer experience, the vertical one would be author experience, and we have 4 quadrants, of course. And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but the bottom left is a place that I call dictatorship, and I call it this because this is a place where when the company is not focused much on customer experience, they're not focused much on author experience, they're really solely focused on probably cost and some of their own goals. And this is a place where we force authors into one tool and we force customers into one tool. We know there's a single point of failure on either of those, and it's a place where customers won't self-serve. Moving up, we have what I call the Anarchy Zone. And this is a place where we actually are really focused on author experience from an enterprise level. And because of that, we have really happy authors, which means they're pumping out a high volume of content, they're pumping out really high quality content, and the authors sometimes get a little overconfident. And so while they believe that they're creating the best customer experience for their customers, nobody is actually focused enterprise-wide on the customer experience. And therefore, we create disparate content experiences across all of the different silos. So in essence, what we're doing here is exposing our silos to our customers. Now, the bottom right, this is a place I call Imaginary Kingdom. And I call it this because it's a place that really can't exist for very long. And the reason for that is initially we create really happy customers because the organization as a whole is focused on customer experience. But author operations become so inefficient that they can't always sustain production. And so we don't have happy authors. We don't have them pumping out a whole lot of great quality content. And so because of that, the customer experience simply can't be all that great. So we might start out in Imaginary Kingdom, but very quickly we'll slip back into the bottom left. And so then the place we all want to be, and that is Content Utopia. And Content Utopia is where we are focused as an entire organization on the customer experience. We're also heavily focused on the author experience. This is a place where customers have access to answers wherever they want to get them. Authors can write tools or write in tools that they are really comfortable with. They're pumping out a high volume of content. They're pumping out high quality content. Customers are highly engaged because they're able to come in whatever door they want to come in, and we're answering their questions from there. So this is a model, and I want everyone to pay attention and think, look on the screen and think, which quadrant do you think your company's in right now? Because I'm going to ask you to self-select in just a second. So we will go ahead to this. We're going to start the poll here, and I'm going to have Paul respond to this model while you guys are self-selecting where you believe you guys belong. So go ahead and start the poll, please, Trey. And Paul, why don't you work a lot with writers that go into all kinds of organizations. What do you think of this model?
Well, Megan, it's a good chart, and it does do a nice job of explaining that there's more to content development than cost, right? So it's a little misleading in that it kind of pits the author experience against the customer experience, and it seems that might be a false choice. I think it's probably possible to optimize for both at the same time. And I think where you see these tensions exist is when you're trying to create a common customer experience across different product teams or different divisions, where the customer experience might be working with lots of different parts of your organization, and your authors may be focused on a specific topic or product. And they may, in order to kind of unify that experience or try to help improve the experience for the customer, they may have to learn a new tool, and often that leads to angst because they're not familiar with that particular tool. But learning tools often isn't all that hard. It's, you know, all the tools vendors are really striving to make them easy to use, and just because something is unfamiliar doesn't mean it's necessarily difficult to use. And sometimes authors are limited by their own experience. Sometimes customers are too. Sometimes moving to a new UI can be disruptive in terms of their experience at first, but as they learn to use the new model as compared to the old one, they'll find that it's easier to navigate or easier to find things to their benefit. So those are some thoughts about your chart.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thanks for that. So just so that everybody knows, it looks like, I'm actually surprised by the results. So far we have 45% are saying that they're in the Anarchy Zone. So that's interesting. 23% in the Imaginary Kingdom. 21% are in the Dictatorship quadrant, and only 8% are in Content Utopia. That part's not hard to believe because it's very hard. And kind of to your point, Paul, it is possible to pit author experience and customer experience against each other, but also have them work together. And that is the purpose of Content Utopia, right? We want to move up and to the right in this chart, and anything we can do to make that move is a good thing. So, okay, so we can kind of refer back to this model a bit, but I want to change tack just a bit and talk about some problem statements. So, Tom, having worked at Amazon, I know how important it is to define the problems. So I know that you're very, very good at defining the problems. And we've compared notes a bit, and we've discussed the primary problems faced by technical content teams. And I think they really stretch across all kinds of content teams. But can you, from your standpoint, define the problem that we're trying to solve by explaining just some of the issues you've seen in technical content throughout your career?
Yeah. So I work with a developer portal, and we have lots of different documentation sets and products on the developer portal. It's highly similar to other documentation portals that just have a lot of different products, right? And what happens in these portal environments is that you have usually a dedicated group of tech writers who kind of manage the documentation or developer portal content, and more teams contribute to it. The documentation can just start kind of flowing into this portal and start to drown some of the tech writers. In some cases, you might have the ratio of tech writers to engineers or other contributors could be 1 to 100 or more. And a lot of these docs that start flowing in might be written in all kinds of different ways. You might have some that are just one giant FAQ, others where people don't have any release notes. They just make changes and never sort of add release notes. Others where they've got their own style going. Maybe they decide we're not going to end sentences with a period. So you can have a lot of different content, and as a tech writer trying to kind of manage the content, you're faced with this problem of scale. How do you clone yourself to kind of review, edit, create, manage, publish all this content? It seems like a trend in most companies, big tech companies, is that the engineering and product groups seem to expand somewhat faster than the tech writing resources for those teams. So we have to figure out, how do you scale without just hiring a bunch of tech writers to manage all this incoming content for the portal?
Right, that was a really good definition, and it's important to note that while your background's in tech content and my background's in tech content, I've also seen this happen in marketing content, I've seen it happen in support content, and just sort of organization-wide, it definitely is a big problem. And so now let's forward on and talk about the solutions to the problems. There are a few out there, and so what are some of the ways that you have seen organizations address this problem of having many, many different teams, all of whom create different types of content?
There's 5 different models that you might see. The first one would be your traditional centralized doc group, and this group would act as a developer portal governing authority. They review all contributions, they make sure that the content meets standards, they cast judgment upon what can be added or removed, they govern all the content. Maybe they're just processing pull requests, but they're definitely the gatekeeper and they approve or reject everything. Another model is one that's kind of referred to as a center of excellence, where the tech writers are kind of like tutors that are farmed out to different teams as needed. This center of excellence maybe also provides templates, other kind of help for contributors. Maybe they review the documents and provide feedback. They're kind of like a guiding resource, not a governing resource. Another model is dedicated decentralized doc groups. In this model, there's no real centralization. Each tech writing team or tech writer is part of a siloed doc group. They might have their own practices, workflows, style guides, approach to content. Maybe they say, we're going to publish our reference docs with this tool, and another team says, no, we're going to publish our reference docs with another tool. And they don't really have any obligation to one another. They just sort of operate independently. A fourth model is the distributed model, which is a hybrid between centralized and decentralized. In the distributed model, tech writers, they are embedded with product teams, but they report loosely to a tech comm manager of some kind. In other words, they're co-located with usually engineering teams or other product teams. They try to attend their stand-ups or whatever meetings and embed, and they're sort of specialized with those groups. But the reporting chain still has some kind of alignment with a tech comm group. And then 5, there's another model of just having the work be outsourced. And because Paul has a lot more experience with this, I'm going to let him speak to kind of what this outsourced model is.
Well, it comes as no surprise that outsourced is my favorite of these 5, since that's the business that we're in. But yeah, I mean, oftentimes, whether you have a centralized model or a distributed model, if your resources don't go as far as they need to, and you have a skunk works that's coming together faster than you thought, you can get caught behind. And sometimes you just need a quick solution, and you need someone to work with your product team immediately, figure out what needs to get set up, what needs to get done to make a deadline, to make a launch date, to update a new release, whatever the current emergency is, and you can turn to an outsource model so you don't have to distract your product management team or your engineering leadership team with managing the doc effort too. You can turn to a company like Expert Support and get that work done on an outsource basis.
Very good. Yeah, outsourcing is really a great thing to help augment capacity, especially as a team is trying to grow and do more. When you haven't quite grown enough to justify bringing on another writer, it's great to have the opportunity to bring someone in from the outside that can just sort of step in part-time and help. So that's great. Tom, question for you on... Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, sometimes it kind of, once it gets established with that motivation, it sticks. We have some engagements where once it's working, they don't want to break it, right? So it just kind of continues on.
That's true. Very good. Tom, question for you. You called the distributed model kind of a hybrid between the centralized and decentralized group. With the center of excellence, that would kind of be a different hybrid, right? Wouldn't they both be considered hybrids between those two?
Yeah, I think that could be fairly classified as a hybrid. Okay.
I just wanted to confirm that because we are moving into a very popular discussion, which is to centralize or not to centralize. And this is such a difficult discussion. I had to put cute dogs on the screen because this is just one of those mind-blowing things that nobody has the right answer. But we want to talk through some of the pros and cons of centralization and decentralization. And I will ask eventually for a poll question about which bucket the audience fits into, and we'll get some of those answers, but I'll hold off on that for just a sec. So Paul, can you talk to me about some of the reasons teams might decide to centralize their content operations?
Certainly. I think, you see that, companies realize that their customers have an experience that spans various products. And what they're trying to do is improve the customer experience. So what you learn adopting one product, when you buy another product, you can leverage that understanding. So it gets easier and easier to work with additional products from one vendor in that way. And the customers can leverage the learning from one product into the next. And so that motivates a lot of style guides and other things that can help try to promote a more consistent brand and a more consistent message and a more consistent experience across multiple product lines. And in addition to that, I think there are some efficiencies to gain from an authoring, authoring efficiency perspective, where you can establish common tools and standards around workflow and practices, and you can build a community of authors across those different product teams that are approaching things in a more consistent way to help foster that more common experience.
I think that's well said. That's a really good summary of the benefits of centralization. And centralization, I think, also just psychologically feels right to documentation managers because it gives us full control and access to all of our writers. It gives us full control over our tools. So there's something to be said for us being able to lead a domain in which we have full control. And so I think that's a really good way to put it. But we also know, Tom, that there are risks involved with centralized teams, or more importantly, maybe benefits of decentralizing the teams. So can you kind of talk about the disadvantages of centralized teams or the advantages of decentralized?
Yeah, and this is my favorite part. I love to play the opposing point of view here because, centralization sure can lead to a better customer experience, right, in terms of branding and standards and having the content look like it all comes from the same company. But there are significant trade-offs that happen with centralization. The first is that when tech writers are centralized rather than embedded with product teams, they're going to have less visibility with product teams. And this means they'll have less awareness of what's going on with those teams. They'll have less rapport with engineers who are essential for reviewing the docs and informing them about changes. When you're not embedded with teams, you're less likely to know who's who. You're likely to be kept out of the loop. You won't develop as specialized degree of knowledge that you might otherwise have. Centralization sort of lends itself more towards being a generalist. And what is the consequence of all this? Well, the consequence is that potentially the documentation's value could be lower because it doesn't have that high degree of information, that specialized, like in-the-loop information, up-to-date, current, relevant, accurate information that is more likely to be produced by somebody who's embedded with product teams. So while standards about branding and terms and styles are important for the customer experience, content trumps all of that. And I think customers might tolerate some variation in styles for more accurate and up-to-date content. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that could be said about this for pros and cons. There's definitely both. But yeah, those are some of the risks of centralization.
Yeah, I think those are really good ones. And before we carry on, Paul, I'll hear from you in a sec, but I want to kick off the poll question, and that is, which organization best describes content operations at your company? So Trey, if we can go ahead and kick off that poll, that'd be great. And then Paul, I think you had something to say?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that the challenges that Tom articulates here are risks. And I would add to that list, I would say that sometimes centralized teams can wind up really favoring a couple of lead product areas where, some products have bigger efforts and they're responsible for bigger revenue, and so other products don't get the attention that they need from that centralized group, or in the worst case, there becomes a backlog where there are delays in getting the work done because it goes through an inefficient process. But those are challenges that can get fixed around process. In fact, I think those challenges that centralized teams faced are not all that different from the challenges an outsourced teams face. When we parachute in a writer, we really do become part of that team and try to establish the relationships and act as if we are a member of that team, even though our writer obviously works for us. But it's
right.
The challenges are there. I think it's a good laundry list.
Yeah. Well said. So I think we can kind of agree that we can't solve the to centralize or not to centralize problem for people, that they have to think through the pros and cons that are there. There's one additional benefit, Tom, that you had talked about in that tech writers feel more valued in a distributed model, and you actually presented this data to me, and I'm wondering if you can kind of talk through the data that's on the screen right now.
Yeah, so I was really curious to know if there was any correlation between an organization's model, centralized, decentralized, or distributed, and the sort of tech writer's sense of value to the organization. For example, in the distributed or this hybrid model, do tech writers feel more value to the organization? And in general, they do feel a little bit more valuable to the organization. You can see that 44% of people felt that model works best, whereas fewer people like the other models. But in general, it was very hard to sort of draw strict correlation between the org model and value. People felt that other factors were kind of more important overall to the sense of value. Other factors like having a documentation sponsor, having healthy allocation of projects, the way that you go about your workflows and how you interact with project teams. Like all of these things seem to ring more true as important rather than the model that you find yourself in. But I do think that I have kind of a hypothesis in the back of my mind that like a tech writer's value is sort of highly correlated with the value of the documentation they produce. If you produce low value documentation, tech writers in that org are going to likewise have low value. So if you want to increase your sense of value in the organization, the best approach is to create high value documentation content. And how can you best create high value documentation content? Well, if the distributed model best lends itself to that high value output, then that is probably the best model for tech writers. And most people did have a consensus that they felt that the distributed model, where you're embedded with product teams, but you report to a TechCom group, seemed to be ideal. That was by far the clear winner in terms of preferences. And there was also a strong trend that people felt that they could produce higher value content if they had fewer projects. When the tech writers allocated to 6 to 10 projects, one survey respondent said that it kind of keeps tech writers dumb, right? It's like you can't really dive deep into them. And so your level of input is kind of bland and not really insightful. And then if you can't make insightful, you can't provide insightful comments about design and workflows and other aspects, then your value is not that high. So I think that like the model does matter, but you can probably overcome any kind of limitations and find a way to make it work wherever you are. Right.
It's really interesting, first of all, that you did this research. I love that you did the research. What types of tech writers are included in your research? Like, how did you get your sample?
Well, this is an informal sort of survey on my blog. I had a post that was trying to understand the reasons why tech writers are sometimes laid off. Because this came up in some other thread. People were talking about, oh, you know, tech writers are the first to go because of X or Y or Z. And I was thinking back to like previous experience 7 years ago when our whole tech pubs group had been laid off. So I was like diving into the reasons. I interviewed all my former colleagues, and it was really fascinating. And I wanted to, I felt like the org model in our old place contributed to the sort of devaluation and of the role. And I wanted to see if that was any larger trend.
Very interesting. Yeah, I love that you did that. And I think what you've sort of shown here is that maybe a hybrid model will help your writers feel more valued, but when we think back to the model that I presented at the beginning, we have to be thinking both about how valued the authors feel as well as what the customer experience is. And so I think based on the discussion we've had today, I think we can clearly say that it kind of depends on the organization you're in, the goals that you have, the type of content you're developing, the scope and complexity and maybe technical detail of the content. All of these things will factor into whether you decide to do one of these things. But no matter which way you go, you should think about the pros and the cons of each of the different organizations. Is that fair, Paul?
I think so, and I think the fact of the matter is in most organizations, the tech writing community winds up working for people in the organization that have never done tech writing. So it's often the case where it's easy to mismanage kind of what that authoring experience is, because it's often, you know, the writers are struggling with issues like too many projects or being spread too thin, and that looks like inefficiency, and it's easy to underestimate the work that the writer actually has to go do if you've never actually had to go do that work, right? So I think an element, regardless of the model, is to have empathy for what that writer is trying to accomplish, just as the writer is trying to have empathy for who the user is and what the user is trying to accomplish, and or is organizing his work that way so as to make for that better customer experience. So it's, you know, different organizations can apply these models in different ways to great effect. We've seen it work lots of different ways. We've also seen it fail lots of different ways.
Right.
So it's about kind of the value system of the organization and recognizing just how important the work of the tech writer really is in that overall customer experience.
Right.
Yeah, I just want to add a comment there. I really like this call out to like the sort of internal customer experience, right? When these product teams request documentation and start working with a tech writer, there's definitely a benefit to champion the centralized model where you have a consistent process, right? If every tech writer has to reinvent his or her own workflow and process, it does leave these internal teams constantly scratching their heads, not sure about what the process is. I've actually been sketching out our own process to formalize it. And I think once, like in an organization, if you can standardize and formalize a process so that internal teams know what to expect, you know, when to pull in the tech writer, what the process is, the review process, and it's a standard, that can be a huge win and an efficiency win for the tech writer group, because you don't have to suddenly teach a new team all over again what the process is.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And you know what? That leads us nicely into our next topic of discussion, which is where we look at, we know now that we can get to content utopia kind of with any one of these organizations, but we want to get a little more prescriptive. And so we have 8 elements or things that you must do while scaling your team. And I think what you just brought up, Tom, will probably come into this. So let's talk about optimizing content delivery in CX. And you guys you can split these up and just kind of go with them, but these are the 8 things that we've established. So Paul, do you want to go ahead and start?
Certainly. Well, style guide is, kind of at the top of the list there with the glossary for very good reasons. I mean, those are the way you, the consistencies across your organization to kind of elevate your particular approach. How you're describing things, what's the tone and voice elements of the writing that you do, and what are the definition of terms that you use and how do you use them? Oftentimes we'll see different product teams using the same term in different contexts with very different definitions. And when that happens, you recognize the train wreck that causes in the mind of the customer, where they're expecting a term to mean one thing and in fact it means another in a different context. And if you have to explain that increases the cognitive load that the customer faces in trying to use the product at hand, and it erodes your customer experience. So it's really important to kind of explain things using the same tone, the same voice, using the same definitions in the same ways across the largest possible swath of the product experience as you can, right?
Yeah, just to echo, what Paul was saying on the glossary issue, I mean, I think that is so foundational to any kind of content harmony. And it depends on your organization, right? But to give an example, like I ran into a case where I was using video skill in one context and another team was using it in a totally different context. And this leads to chaos when people search for this term and how they interpret it, and leads users to different, paths. And I mean, any kind of harmony has to be established with some sense of terms so that they don't, at the very least, conflict in gross ways like that.
That's a great example. What about taxonomy?
Well, I think you need some way to organize your thoughts, right? You need some, whether, taxonomy is one of multiple information architecture kind of approaches that you can take. And it helps with navigation, it helps with search, it helps with, chunking the content into the right size of thing and then putting it in the right place. So it can help in a lot of ways, and it leads to, better organization. Interestingly, it can also lead to better software. Sometimes when we're working with an engineering team, we will be trying to understand how they approach something, and a writer might say to the lead engineer, well, wouldn't it be simpler if we just organized it this way? And the developer might say, well, I never really thought about it that way. Let me think about that. And then lo and behold, in the next release, the organization and naming conventions begin to change, and the software gets easier to manage and understand as well, not just the experience of using it. Right.
Nice. That kind of covers. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to dive into structured content and metadata.
Go for it.
This is another facet that I think is essential to get right, and it really usually, like, if you have a developer portal or documentation portal, there's some standard tool that a lot of people are plugging into, some system or tool set, and it's just impossible to sort of structure the content in any predictable way if people are using different tags and different metadata. Probably the biggest one to get right is like the description tag. How long should it be? Should it be included, not? How people start out docs with that description varies tremendously, but it's incredibly useful not just for like predictable display, but also for search engine optimization and other factors.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So we know that we need some sort of a federated search or some way to unify search across. Do you have any examples of that or things to share with that, Paul?
Well, I think, search is great if you know what you're looking for. But if you don't know what you're looking for, it can be hard to search for it. And that's why books have a table of contents and an index, right? The index is kind of based on search terms, and the TOC is there for helping you find the thing that you need to know when you're not really sure what you're looking for. And, you know, using search is awesome because it can find you a list of things across the doc set, but it may not tell you exactly what you're looking for right now. And it's important not to rely too much on search and to organize your content in a way that kind of guides the user through the experience kind of based on the tasks that they're trying to accomplish. Maybe not necessarily what the technology can do, but what the user's trying to use it for most often. And if you can organize your content in that way and kind of drag the experience along those lines, you'll find that more users get more value more quickly by using your documentation efforts. So that's,
yeah, that's a good way to put it. And I think from the customer standpoint, what we're trying to avoid is having a customer come to a search bar looking for a white paper, but that particular search bar doesn't actually index the white papers that they saw the last time they were on our site. So
yeah, or when it changes,
to create that unified search. Yeah, interesting. All right, list of docs you need to deliver. We don't want to go into detail on these, but can you talk about why it's important, and then we can kind of get into the standardized efficient workflows that you kind of hit on before, Tom?
Sure. Like on the list of docs you need to deliver, I think there are several callouts that I just think every doc set needs. One is like a proper overview that describes what the product is, a getting started tutorial, a sense of release notes. You know, there's some basic categories that you can just kind of check boxes whether they have them or not. And when you have these standard patterns, it helps users kind of understand your system from doc set to doc set. On the workflows, I think this is also incredibly important, like especially if, let's say you have a docs as code model where people are all using Git to contribute to the same doc system. Well, if you have one team following one Git workflow, another team following a different Git workflow, very quickly you're going to end up with merge conflicts, confusion, frustration, you know, the whole like understanding of which branches are the important ones and which, you know, how they flow to production and other environments is critical, right? Like you just can't operate unless you have that.
Very nice. And lastly, executive buy-in. Who wants to talk about that?
Actually, look, I do have something to say about that. Like anytime you have a website, who decides what's on the homepage and like what are your user journeys through that site? If you don't have any sense of priorities about your company's products, you know, if every team just has its own priority and their own products as its own priority, then you end up with a hodgepodge kind of doc portal where everything is priority. And if that's the case, users sort of it can be confused, right? Just even figuring out what goes on the homepage can be this huge political nightmare if you don't have any kind of alignment on strategic priorities.
Very nice. Good. Okay, so this kind of brings us to the end. We have a number of questions, I think, from the audience. So just to sort of recap, we've given you some, basically the problem statement. We gave you a model to understand how you think about author experience versus customer experience. We talked about some of the strategies or the organizations you could set up, whether they're centralized or decentralized or some combination thereof. And then we've given you 8 elements to help you optimize your content delivery and customer experience. So Tom, Paul, thank you so much. We still have some questions from the audience, so I'm going to throw it back over to Scott to run that.
Awesome, and this is really good because I've been getting questions not only in the graphic user interface, so for those of you who are watching the show, those over 120 some people that are still here, you can use the Ask the Questions tab to text us a question. We'll try to get Tom and Paul and Megan to answer them as quickly as possible. All right, to get started with that, let's just go ahead and dive in. This first question will be for Megan. Megan, here we go. This one I think is best aligned for you. This person says, one of the worst parts of our customer experience is the silos. How can I implement a federated search when our content teams are authoring and publishing content in different places? Is that even something that you can do? Bring it all together?
Yeah, it's funny you ask that because that's exactly what Zubin does. So yes, we should talk, but it's super, super, super important to allow those silos to be able to continue to author in the tools they're comfy. That's so, so, so important for the author experience. At the same time, you need to be able to deliver all of that content in a unified and personalized way to all of your different touch points, whether that's your doc portal, inside Salesforce, whatever, like all your different touch points. And so, yes, there's a way to do it. You need a lot of the stuff, the 8 elements that we just went through. Taxonomy is huge in part of that, but we can talk through that in more detail. So I suggest just reach out to me on LinkedIn or email me and we'll chat.
Tom, do you have a list of docs that you need to deliver for reference, something that kind of keeps you aligned?
For reference, or just like for API docs, or
sorry, these questions don't come with a person attached to them. So the question is, do you have a list of docs you need to deliver? That's in quotes, documents that you need to deliver.
I do.
Oh.
I have a list.
Yep.
You go to there's an article on our website called the Ideal Documentation Suite for Software Developers. It assumes a developer audience. So if you're writing for software developers, that's a good checklist you can use, because each deliverable on that list addresses a different facet of the overall developer experience. It's ideal for, it's in the library at expertsupport.com. If you just go to expertsupport.com and
it's not in the attachments and links section of today's webinar viewing panel. I apologize for that. We didn't know that would be referenced here. So could you use the URL, say the URL one more time, Paul?
Certainly. It's just expertsupport.com/library.
Great. Tom, should a tech writing team report to an R&D team or another team? What's your view?
Sorry, I actually wanted to add one other additional thing on the previous question. Another resource, if you go to my API doc site from I'dRatherBeWriting.com and click the API documentation, I do have a list of different doc types, especially in the conceptual section. Things like, I already mentioned the overview and getting started, but if you have like an API, there's an authentication section, status and error codes, rate limiting, that kind of thing.
Okay,
sorry, can you repeat the question again that you had?
Should a tech writing team belong to or report to an R&D organization or another team in your view?
Wow, I love that question. Like, where does TechCom best belong? I believe it best belongs in engineering, because you're kind of doing information engineering. You're developing information in the same way that softwares are developing code. I don't think it fits very well under product managers. It doesn't fit very well under marketing, interestingly enough. And yeah, I honestly feel like engineers sense the value the most of docs, because if docs aren't well explained to customers, then customers file tickets that get escalated to engineers. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on placement.
As Silicon Valley technical content director, wants to make a comment that earlier Tom was talking about embedded teams. She said, all too often we allow ourselves to focus on the wrong thing. This is the wrong thing to focus on. Embedding is only a tactic. You don't have to use the same tactics, and yet you can still be centralized or decentralized. In my view, collaboration is the challenge, and embedding doesn't guarantee collaboration, nor does it guarantee teamwork or effectiveness. So I think she just wanted us to talk about the fact that we should focus on the right things when we're trying to make a decision what to measure.
Yeah, that's it. That was kind of, that point expresses a lot of the feelings in the survey, where just embedding with a team doesn't solve all the problems. There are larger issues, like she said, collaboration and how people collaborate, right? How you integrate, how you review content, and how different leaders place importance on those processes. It's hugely important.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. The other thing I would like to say is to the audience member who's trying to be helpful by sharing URLs in the questions tab, no one else but me can see those things. So I appreciate your help, but I'm not able to do anything with those URLs that you're sharing. But thank you anyway. Tom, what do you think the general position regarding buy-in from the top? Do you need buy-in from the top, and where's the top?
Yeah, I mean, in my survey, a ton of people indicated executive sponsorship as a leading reason for why tech writers are valued or let go. And where is that top? I don't know. And honestly, trying to influence up is a huge challenge, which I've kind of struggled to figure out to crack that sort of nut. But I do think that like there are many opportunities to influence up, and tech writers were way too quiet. We don't necessarily promote the work that we're doing in visible ways. When I think about my blog and how that's kind of led towards to visibility and influence, it's a simple recipe of write and share with your audience. So like internally, when we write, we need to follow that up with sharing with the audience and include those higher level leaders so that they can kind of become more doc champions and sponsors. I think that's kind of the pattern.
Paul, do you see any trends? This viewer wants to know about moving away from help files and more toward contextualized tooltips, windows embedded in products, for example, a difference in the deliverables people are making?
Yeah, it's a good observation, and yes, we do see that trend. It used to be that everything was written in FrameMaker and you generate a PDF and send it to a printer and you were done. It didn't really matter what you were documenting. And now we've seen all of a real trend towards certainly online help in terms of HTML5 responsive websites that are what used to be in the manual is now on a website, and now we're seeing that move into the product experience itself. In fact, probably the fastest growing part of our practice is UX writing, which is exactly the kinds of things that you're beginning to see in software, hover text and tool tips and better menus, all of those kinds of things. So yes, that's a trend.
Excellent. One of the viewers also says, don't forget chatbots, voice interfaces, augmented reality, all kinds of other things. That's right. Not all that print-focused tech writers think about is what they're kind of pointing out. And I think that's true. If you came from a print online help background, it's probably an easy jump just to go to contextual help, but some people are leapfrogging over that altogether and starting to provide voice-activated solutions that bring you back to a video, for example, which circumvents the whole need to have a tooltip.
Yep. No, it's really what's the path of least resistance for the user, and it's also important to think about there's difference between learning how to solve a little problem, which can be solved by a tooltip or maybe a short video, and right. Knowing kind of acquiring a skill set, which might require lessons over time. And we're seeing user interfaces now evolve where it's simple when you start and they reveal more complexity over time as the user kind of climbs that learning curve. So it's influencing all of software, but the more complicated understanding of work you can do with a particular technology sometimes involves more efficient learning through lessons and tutorials and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. One viewer points out that it's nice that we took a survey and asked people what they believe or perceive, but those things don't often shake out as being true. For example, I can remember on a webinar that Scott produced where he asked technical writers if they believe in different learning styles, and almost everyone did, while those things aren't true. So I think that's danger, I guess, in relying on the data. But Tom, you never said that these things were held in true. I think you were trying to measure what people were feeling and thinking at the time. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, look, my survey is informal. It's not like any rigorous thing. But there were 50 to 100 responses, and it was just meant to get like a general trend. I do think I was sort of surprised that no academic study had ever been done to try to correlate like your organization model with value of TechCom, even though value has been like the perennial discussion for years in the discipline. And like you don't need a ton of super rigorous double-blind sort of studies and data to get a general sense of things. I mean, I think it was clear that like people really think that distributed models work best.
Yeah. And of course, what people think is obviously something we need to go measure before we decide to reconfigure an entire company because we read a survey.
That's right.
Between one of the viewers didn't catch the difference that you were trying to make between a centralized organization and a COE. Could you repeat those differences again?
Well, you know, as others pointed out, like the COE model is more blended. Like in our group, we have these people that are documentation bar raisers, and they're sort of loaned out as almost like tutors or like writing assistants for different projects. I didn't really know how that model, like where you fit that model in these larger buckets of centralized, decentralized, hybrid. I mean, the reality is that like there's a lot of gray areas and fuzzy overlap between different models, and some might have like part centralized, part distributed. So it gets kind of murky, and this is probably one of those murky areas.
Would it be correct to say that all these approaches that you talked about today, excluding outsourcing, assumes that you actually have a technical writing team in terms of dedicated roles and staff and people with those capabilities versus some or all kind of moonlighting to contribute content, which I think is a different model altogether? This person says they're struggling through implementing a new knowledge system, standards and best practices, and that they're the only dedicated documentation resource or expert in their company.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that, looking at these slides. I was like, this really caters to big companies with multiple tech writers and teams. But the reality is, in other surveys I've done on my site or in dev docs, about a third of tech writers are lone writers. So what model is the lone writer? I mean, you're kind of like, you're everything, I guess. But yeah, it doesn't really address the lone writer scenario very well. I'll admit that.
Well,
it's a little bit like the center of excellence would just be one person, right? You would just be scurrying around trying to be the mentor for all these other groups that are trying to write.
Yeah, you would definitely be a mentor role, I think. We will have Tom come back and talk about individual tech writers one day and how they might be able to address the same challenges, but maybe with different approaches. All right, well, thanks to you for all of your support today and answering these questions. They were great answers. So I appreciate you being thoughtful about them. And thanks to Megan for kind of spearheading and leading this conversation. You did a great job. Thank you very much for doing that today. And thanks for Tom and Paul for joining us. We appreciate you being here on today's show. I am really excited because there's lots of activity in the questions section. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions, but we'll share the questions with Megan and with Tom and Paul, and if they can write a blog post or somehow address some of these questions in the future, they will, I'm sure. And let's also thank today's software, Zoom-In, our sponsor, Zoom-In Software. You can download content about Zoom-In Software and learn all about what they do and how they help companies bring all their content together to help their consumers and also customer support agents do the best job that they can, which is all about customer experience, and we talk about that every time. So don't forget to check out the downloads and attachments provided by Zoom-In. You can download those anytime on the show today. Also, I want to tell you about a few quick shows that are coming up. First of all, August the 12th, we'll have Ann Rockley and Val Swisher will do a duo tag team presentation designed specifically for medical device content creators. They're going to talk about using structured content to manage the complexities of a global medical device content set. There's a lot of detail in this particular presentation, so if you're in the weeds in that industry, you're not going to want to miss that show. Also, I'll be interviewing Bill Kava with Patrick Bozek August the 13th. We're going to talk a lot about structured content and how it powers the healthcare revolution that's going on with assistive devices like talking devices and conversational things like Siri and Alexa. You're not going to want to miss that. And then Tuesday, August the 18th, Megan will be back with me, and we are going to interview and have a great chat about scaling your organization with an executive coach and scaling expert, Karen Walker. You don't want to miss that call as well. And Val Swisher comes back at the end of the month to give you a best practices session on creating reusable content. Jennifer Morse from Madcap Software will join us at the end of the month to talk more about the search experience and how using micro content can help you improve that for your customers. So tons of shows coming up. I appreciate you being here. Be on the lookout for those invitations from the Content Wrangler. And thanks for joining us today. My name is Scott Abel, signing off. Don't forget to give us a rating on the way out and let Megan know how you thought of today's show using our 1 through 5 star rating system. You can click the button and type in a little comment. I know they'd like to hear your feedback. Thanks for joining us. You've been watching Optimizing Content Development, Grow Your Content Faster Than You Grow Your Team, brought to you by Zoom and Software. Thanks for joining us. Stay well, be safe, keep doing great work. Bye-bye.